and welcome to Tattvadeep, Conversations and Explorations. For our third episode on biology, we sat down with Professor Gunter Wagner. Professor Wagner is an evolutionary biologist with training in biochemical engineering, zoology, and mathematics from the University of Vienna, Austria. Professor Wagner is a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at Yale University and head of the Wagner Lab. Dr. Wagner's research interest is the evolution of gene regulation as it pertains to the origin of evolutionary novelties and the developmental basis of character identity, for instance, in the case of digit identity of birds. In 2010, Dr. Wagner was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. We talked about evolutionary change as a historical process, how an accumulation of these historical processes and achievements gives rise to the aspect of predictability in form and function of biological systems, how challenges faced by biology are different from those faced by the inorganic sciences, how biology defines identity, the real reason why one must learn many terminologies in biology, the relationship between individuals and self-destruction, the meaning of a gene, and the selective advantage of intuition. We hope this conversation can help the listeners see the tattva, or true essence of biology, and its potential to help us understand how life came to be and the various ways in which it evolves with and through humans as well as all other living beings. Hello, Professor Wagner. Welcome to Tattvadeep.
Good afternoon, Tisha.
Good afternoon, Professor. So I have prepared a few questions to understand biology from you a little better. But for my first question, I'd like to take a little time to explain the point that I'm trying to get to. So please bear with me. So this series on biology that we are having, I've already spoken to a couple of biologists. So one of the first questions I'm asking all of them is, what is biology? So here is one answer that stood out for me. There were very many interesting answers. One that stood out for me was from an Indian professor who's with Purdue University, Mr. Professor Ramaswamy. So he said, and I'll quote it for you. He said, biology is a general term used to define anything that is living or capable of replicating. Then he went on to talk about a biological and a non-biological system, and he gives the example of a dead fruit which rots as it having reached an equilibrium with its environment. And then he explains how life is something that is able to separate itself from the environment and maintains its own equilibrium that's inside it, which is different from the equilibrium outside it. So that was essentially his definition of biology. Then as a non-expert, I also reach out to films, because films have been doing talking, so to speak, for a lot of these subjects that we are trying to cover here. So one film that came out that left quite an impression on me was this 2018 film called Annihilation. I don't know if you've seen it. Annihilation. No. So in that, the lead character, she is a biologist. And she's teaching a bunch of students in the class, and she's showing them a video of cells, one cell dividing. And her dialogue goes something like this. It's a cell. Like all cells, it is born from an existing cell. By extension, all cells were born from one cell, a single organism alone on planet Earth, perhaps alone in the universe. About 4 billion years ago, 1 became 2, 2 became 4, the rhythm of the dividing pair. The structure of everything that lives and everything that dies. And then she shows the visual that she was showing was of a cell from of a tumor taken from a 30-year-old woman from her cervix. So that was why she said, as everything dying. So what stuck out here for me was that something that is dying also has a structure. I don't know if it is factually true, if biology say how on point this dialogue is in terms of what actually biology is, but it did leave an impression on me. And then I started to think, from what Professor Ramaswamy said, here is the environment, and then there is something that separates itself from the environment and has an equilibrium. And as long as it maintains that equilibrium, it is living. And then something is dying. Even though it's dying, it has a structure, but perhaps what's happening is that there is the equilibrium that maintained its life that has shifted, and the structure that is now forming is different from the structure of what would have been if it was alive. I mean, if it was living. And then if the imbalance goes on, if the equilibrium is further disintegrated, then it's dead. Right? So it's like going back to the environment. So I started to wonder, is biology understanding the relationship between environment, living, dying, and then back to the environment? Is this kind of a trinity what biology studies, and then essentially all branches of biology? That's the question.
I agree with your previous interviewees that one of fundamental aspect is that organisms and they are alive because they resist decay and are able to harvest energy from the environment to maintain their own structure and activities. It is also the case that, as you inferred, that even the process of dying is not a random process, but one that is highly structured and conditional upon the way life is sustaining itself. And you can see that from the simple fact that there is a science of pathology that basically tells you how, in what ways and along what pathways organisms disintegrate or lose their functionality, right? I mean, we have names for diseases which we can only do if what's happening to organisms as they lose their ability to continue living, do it in a structured way. Otherwise, giving names to a random process wouldn't make any sense, right? But so that I'm an evolutionary biologist. So from my perspective, I would add another dimension to what life is and how biology tries to understand it. And that is the fact that unlike most non-living systems, although there are exceptions and we can talk about those, what's fascinating about life, and this is the reason I got into this field, is that it is an open-ended process and is one that where new forms of existence arise continuously, even though slowly, so that we don't see it that easily. We see it quickly with germs that try to kill us. But that same process that creates new forms of germs that attack our body, there are also new forms of higher organisms arising all the time, although at a more slower time scale. But still, and that was really what drove me to become a biologist, namely trying to understand how life as a material process is able to create whatever that means, to come up with qualitatively new forms of life, right? I mean, there's no reason a priori to expect that it would be a better idea to have multicellular organisms like humans and animals and plants and so on, because bacteria do perfectly well in their basic business of creating a difference and a boundary between themselves and the environment and making more copies of themselves, right? They do that perfectly. They do it much better than we do because, it takes us 9 months to get a new baby. They do it in 20 minutes, right? So the really fascinating thing is how complexity comes into the world, how, more complex forms of life could originate. And so that's really what drives my intellectual life. And it is truly the case because my original training was in chemistry.
Right.
And at a certain point, and that's probably just out of the arrogance of young people, I thought I basically understand how chemistry works, right? So we have 92 whatever natural elements, and there are certain rules of how they combine. And even though in particular with carbon containing molecules, there's an infinite possibility of how to combine them. it's fundamentally always the same thing. You take atoms making molecules, take various molecules, make new molecules. That's essentially what's going on. And early on, and yeah, I was a biochemistry major, so I was fascinated by the openness and complexity of what I learned in the little biology that we were taught at the time. And that turned me into a biologist, because that appeared to me being the most fundamental question that a biologist or a scientist, life scientist, can ask. How is it that something like this is possible? Don't ask me for a quick answer, because this is a big problem. I'm not sure a really satisfying or final answer will be achieved in my lifetime. But we get little glimpses of what is going on and how it's possible. So that's probably the aspect that I would add to your previous invitees or invitees to said about biology. It is the creativity that comes with with evolution, and ability to even not only outcompete others, but actually create new stuff, new kinds of existence. I mean, that we have a conversation about evolution or about biology is an amazing thing that most probably bacteria wouldn't be engaging in, because they're busy just making new bacteria. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that alone shows that there's something to it that is fundamentally fascinating.
Great. That's very interesting, Professor. So this we spoke to a few physicists, like I was telling you earlier, and they have these the four principal forces. The electromagnetic force, the strong and weak nuclear force, and then there is gravity, and it's all simple. So it's just four forces. You can count them on your fingers, and then it's with the interaction between these forces. I think that, as far as I've understood it, that a lot of complexity is basically born out of simplicity. And it is their quest is always to go from this four. They want to come down to finding a single thing that explains everything. It seems to be the quest of physics right now, that unified theory of everything. Mathematicians also have a place from where they launch their maths, their approach to math and what they do. They have their set of axioms. There are four axioms that they generally, it's like the spine of mathematics, so to speak. Linguists, they are the other scientists in some sense that we have spoken to, who also believe that fundamentally there are some patterns in language which can help you distinguish between this is a language, even if you don't speak the language, but you know that it has the characteristics that are intuitively imbibed is the characteristic of language versus something that is not a language. Maybe it's the grammar. So there's always something fundamental and something common, like you were saying, like no matter, like a Lego block. So you can build a little robot with a couple of Lego blocks. You can build a huge building, but fundamentally it's all Lego blocks only. So in biology, would you say that there are an underlying principles that are guiding biologists, that is taking the discipline of biology forward, just like these disciplines are being taken forward by their own principles?
I mean, there are a set of principles that we briefly already touched upon, like the fact that living organisms are so-called non-equilibrium systems that always have to consume energy in order to exist. The fact that we have the molecules that contain the information about the structure of organisms are unstable and can sort of change, and which we call mutations, and then mutations lead to natural selection. So there are these overarching principles and ideas, but the problem with biology is, or maybe one way of how biology is different from other sciences, is that we have this fundamental openness, that we can fundamentally not reduce the life of a human to a handful of principles, and that is what you call historicity. And I may go into it a little bit. So it is true that from a physicist's point of view, there are these, 4 fundamental forces. There is a handful of fundamental laws that govern physical processes and also chemical processes, and to large extent also what's going on in an organism, namely what's going on, when I digest food and make new molecules that I need to sustain myself. But it is not the case, and here I'm having a lot of arguments with my friends in physics sometimes, is that the explanatory scope that, of physics, what can they actually predict about biology is very limited. And the reason is that with new forms of existence, new sort of regularities and laws arise that cannot be predicted from the fundamental laws of physics. So that is what I mean by this fundamental creativity of life, being able to produce systems that, living organisms, and let's call them systems to be neutral towards them, which are putting boundaries around the physical and chemical processes that are generated, that are going on inside, which nevertheless determine the outcome, right? So there's nothing in physics and chemistry that would predict that something like a vertebrate or a mammal or a human exists in the way we know them. They are the product of a long chain of historical events that produced systems that are able to sort of constrain and use physics and chemistry to their advantage, but their structure themselves is not predictable from these fundamental laws, right? So in a paradoxical way, life is a process that is built upon what physics and chemistry is telling us, but it is also fundamentally transcending the limits of what these sciences can predict, because the outcome of evolutionary change is a historical process that takes into account or freezes coincidences that happened in long time ago and which are now sort of like a tradition in a culture, constrains what the culture can do. So in a way, there's a more of a continuity of understanding between biology and the cultural sciences than there is between biology and physics, right? There's a fundamental break there. And I think it is best, I mean, I could explain it technically why that is the case, but I'm not sure that is the most effective way to communicate about it. I find analogies to culture more helpful in actually understanding of, or to express what I'm talking about here. So to me, I'm always thinking of organisms like an institution, right? Institutions have their identity, what they are. They are either a church or a university or an army, right? They have their identity in the way what they do and how they are organized. And the interesting thing about organizations is that it is true that all of their activities performed by humans, but in a way the humans are exchangeable, right? So what the individual humans do in an institution is important, and realizing what's going on in a university, but the university continues to be a university even though all the individual human beings have been replaced by other human beings in another generation, right? And it's the same, for molecules and organisms, right? So we have our molecules that get exchanged all the time. We nevertheless maintain our identity, even though, people have calculated that after 7 years, not a single atom in my body is the same as it was 7 years ago. But I'm still, Gunter Wagner, and you are, the same person after 7 years. And this illustrates what's also happening with what's special about organisms. Now, why and how do organizations maintain their identity? And the interesting thing is it is encoded in the rules that determine which individuals can be part of that. You have admission exams for students, right? So not everyone who comes along on the street can become a student. So they have to fulfill some criteria. Once they are in the institution, they have to behave in a certain way or they're kicked out, right? And it is this set of rules that creates a historically sustained organization that is also what's special about organisms, because they have the rules of which molecules they let into the body. If the wrong one comes, you spit it out again, or you get sick, or so, right? And it is also, once the molecule is in your body, the organism determines what to use it for, right? Making fat or making a protein or whatever, right? Or just burn it for energy, right? And of course, organizations are a product of historical change. They came into existence because of some need or to some degree accidental, right? I mean, because there are different forms of social organization in different cultures, which tells us it is a historical contingency that created them. But once they are created, they are quite resilient to losing their identity. They either die if they are not necessarily, if the culture gets destroyed, then they go away. But as long as the culture in which they play a role is maintained, the identity of these organizations or institutions remains the same, in the same way as organisms or species maintain their identity as long as there's an environment in which they can live and are not outcompeted by other organisms and so on. But if everything goes well, they stay the same way fundamentally as we are all, mammals, and mammals are vertebrates, and we share certain organizational features that would be too technical to go into what they are, but that is relatively well understood, that you cannot change everything at the same time with equal probability of success. So therefore, there's a very strong historical conservative force acting on this evolutionary or historical processes of which organisms are part of and of which institutions are part of, right?
So this force is what the laws are?
Well, they are. So the laws, the laws arise from, or what we call laws or predictabilities, arise from the historical structure of that institution that we are talking about. And in the same way, also the regularities or interdependencies between different parts of the body that came about by an evolutionary process. And I'm very careful to not call it just random or accidental, because the randomness and accidents do play a role also in history, but it is not just senseless. It is an accumulation of things that work, right? And so in that respect, it is quite different from a pure random process, as Darwinian evolutionary theory is often misunderstood to be. It is better understood as a. My computer's acting up here. beat him back. Okay, here we are. Because it is a historical process of accumulation of things that work well together. And as long as they work well together, they stay together and are giving us, a certain level of predictability. I mean, basically how universities work, right? They want to teach, they want to, produce more knowledge, and in order to achieve that, we have courses, we have seminars, we have, research opportunities and so on. So once you know it's a university, you know a lot about it.
Yes.
Right? There are a lot of variation in how they are realized or have changed in different countries, but it's the same. And the same is an army, right? You need people who try to kill each other, and you have people who try to control of how they kill each other. That's how armies work. I mean, it's a necessity, unfortunately, but that's how it is. And once you know it's an army, it's hierarchically organized. There are lots of people out there that have less control. Some other have control. The main problem that an army tries to solve is how to get control over an unpredictable process like a battle, and so on, right? And in the same way, if we talk about a mammal, I can tell you that it has to have it has two sexes. The one of them is producing milk, and gestation, so reproduction is almost always internal. You have uterus, a placenta, blah blah blah, and each of them has a vertebral column, and the brain is organized in a certain predictable way, even though there are variations. So there's a lot of predictability in there that comes from the accumulated historical achievements, if you want, right? So this is the way how I understand biology, and in what way biology is faced with a challenge that is fundamentally different from that of the inorganic sciences. And I say this as someone who started out as an inorganic scientist, and deep appreciation for what physics and chemistry has achieved in its history.
Right.
I do see the timer here, and I'm aware of it. Okay.
I think, I also got the timer, but there's something you got right to the heart of it, Professor Wagner. This was so amazing because as you were speaking, I also realized how the language that we use, say English right now, has intuitively grasped this, because we often say the cultural body, the defense body, and we know when we say this, we're talking about in terms of function, we're talking about in terms of sustainability, we're talking perhaps, of course, in terms of identity, we're talking in terms of purpose,
exactly.
Right? That is exactly what we're doing. And because biology is dealing exactly with what everything else seems to be simulating. Right. Everything else is following those, let's say, copying whatever biology is coming up with, all the creativity, the generation that's happening here. And these are the insights that are being applied consciously and unconsciously, I don't know, but there are things that sustain a thing, and there are things that if you follow, they will not sustain a thing. So it's right. So it seems to me, as in human nature, I'm a human being. I would say there's so many of what you've said apply to how you run a family. Like there is purpose, there is maybe a vision mission statement in a marriage, in a relationship, and then there are these two people who are working, and then there is culture that sets expectations, and there is you want to also break free from those expectations, and all of this is allowed. But sometimes the marriage disintegrates, sometimes the marriage sustains, and so something's going on. Certain patterns, when they're repeated, they're good, and that's why a lot of people say don't rock the boat. When it's not broken, why fix it? But at the same time, as you say, while these changes are happening, if they happen, still there is always a chance of something new coming about. And it is that transition, right? It is that transition period which is tough for us because it's changing. We do not know what to expect. So what I want to ask from you is, when you use the word identity, it seems to be directly linked with sustainability. The clearer you are about who you are, a university defines itself its identity, and then runs towards keeping that identity, maintaining that identity. In biology also, is that what keeps our sustainability? And then what is identity in biology for a human being?
Okay, I will answer for biology.
Yes.
And because that's the most general level that I can relate to. So the way we understand identity in biology, at least in my way of thinking about biology, depends highly on historical traceability. If you are able to, so the identity of a let's say being a mammal is because we can trace the history of all the mammals back to a common origin.
Yeah.
And this is and so we realize that there is something that has identity because we can understand it as the product of an ongoing historical process.
Identification, right? That's where identity comes from.
Right. So it has two components, as you have actually already nicely articulated. It has the ability to change and the ability to remain different from others.
Right. Right.
And that is so. Those are the two things that have to come together. Change without limits doesn't lead to identity. Identity comes from the ability to change while changing in your own way. So that is true for humans or for what we call lineages, sort of lines of descent of organisms. A particular species is what it is because it changes in reaction to the world in its own way and in a traceable way, connected to its past, to its ancestors.
Right.
That is the only way how we can, in my thinking, my level of understanding right now, that is the only way how to understand what we mean if we give a biological structure, entity, a name, be it a gene, being a cell type, being a species, or whatever. Right? All of the many things that we study in biology are historical entities. Actually, a colleague of mine teaches along the same lines students at Yale, and he introduces his lecture with the question, so why in biology do we have to learn all these many names? In chemistry, we have also many names, but it's quite limited. In biology, it's basically limitless. You have names for cell types, you have names for body parts, you have names for species, and so on. And the answer is that each of these names denotes a historical entity that originated, is changing in its own way, is therefore recognizable as being different from others, and in the process of the history of life, these type of entities originate all the time. They also get lost. Of course, they can go extinct, like species, or the species that have certain characteristics go extinct, and then this characteristic itself also goes extinct. But there's a sort of an ongoing process that produces new historical entities, like there's an historical process that creates new languages, as long as communication is not homogenized as it is with modern media, right? If you have limited communication over distances, more and more languages are produced. And I think my hotspot of, as I understand it from my Indian friends, is the Indian subcontinent that has probably more languages than anywhere else in the world.
Many languages, yeah.
Right? And being being an example of how spontaneously more and more of this historically changing and self-maintaining processes appear.
So yes, identification, say maybe familiarity, right? Okay. okay, I can identify that as a, let's say, part of this, part of what I know, consciously, unconsciously, intuitively, I can identify. But then what about alien form? And I don't mean aliens, I just mean a form that has not yet been recognized. Is that then the basis of fear? Like biologically speaking, what would you say? Like something that becomes unfamiliar can arouse feelings of fear.
Yeah, I'm afraid here we are entering an area of psychology, and I would sort of hand over the baton to my brother, who is a psychologist and studies notions of monsters and so on. And it is exactly, and here I'm not speaking as an expert, just as a consumer of knowledge. It seems to be that this is exactly how fear and alienation arises, right? And yeah, but as I said, I'm entering an area where I'm not
Conjecture, but
comfortable as assuming the air of authority.
Sure,
When I
I
talk
get it.
about biology, I stand for it. I stand for what I'm saying. But if we go there, I'm as much a consumer of
As I am.
thinking and knowledge as you are. Yeah.
Right. So what I was trying to understand is if there is a biological basis for fear, and you said it's a realm of psychology, ideally. Now, there is an interesting question I have for you. In the same film, Annihilation, I'll take another minute to explain what I'm trying to get to. What is happening is a strange form of mutation, consistent mutation, like something that's always mutating and generating new forms. This alien form, so to speak, has taken over a part of the planet, and it's spreading. Like, it's just growing and it's growing. And so the people of the planet, they're trying to understand what this is. So what they're doing is they're sending their special forces to go inside and see what is going on, what's happening. So anybody who goes in does not come out. So they know that this thing is dangerous, and maybe it's killing us out. We don't know what's going on. One guy turns out, he comes out, but he's in a very bad state. So his wife is the biologist, and she says, I'm going to go in. I'm a biologist. I think I can maybe see what's going on. So when she goes in, another person who's a part of the 5 women team is a psychologist. So they get talking. The biologist and the psychologist, they start to talk. And this biologist, she asks the psychologist, a veteran psychologist, that why do you think my husband applied for the suicide mission? So the psychologist is taken aback. She says, you think it's a suicide mission? Then as a psychologist, I would say that you're confusing suicide with self-destruction. Almost none of us commit suicide, and almost all of us self-destruct. In some way, in some part of our lives, we drink or we smoke, we destabilize the good job or the happy marriage. These aren't decisions, these are impulses. In fact, you're probably better equipped to explain this than I am, because you're a biologist. That's how she ends it. So now there are so many things here. So fear is the realm of a psychologist. I understand it, but is there a biological basis? Maybe, I don't know. But here, clearly, in terms of self-destruction being coded into us, I want to know if it is so, because in one of your interviews with the dissenter, you said that over 90% of our genome consists of apparently parasitic elements, but by having them, we also have the opportunity to innovate new ways of regulating our genes. So it's a scary statement, but it's also a hopeful statement. And I think that's where fundamentally your belief is, because that's how you started talking to me, that new things come out, you can overcome, you can change, process takes time, but it's open to it. So I want to ask you, would you say, let's leave aside fear. I got into this because we're talking about biology and psychology, but in this case, would you say that self-destruction, as this psychologist described it, is encoded into us and is probably like this parasitic element that you were referring to?
I mean, I think to understand the relationship between individuals and destruction is that individual organisms like human beings, we are not the purpose of biology. We are just one realization of our species.
Right.
So our existence is supposed to be a limited one, and the thing that continues is the lineage of the population, or
Life itself.
That's nothing news on so while that is not how we like to exist. It is unfortunately the reality into which we have been born, and so I think that could be the basis or the core of what is meant in the story that you told. So that's probably a contradiction between being the representing something continuing, not eternal, but potentially eternal, but individually being limited is probably the feeling that precipitates these considerations.
Interesting, right. So you are also, please correct me if I'm wrong, but you're also a evolutionary geneticist. Is that right?
Everyone who deals with evolution in a serious way has to be a geneticist as well, because it's genetic change that is underlying evolutionary change. So, but genetics can be a very specialized field, and I would probably offend the hardcore geneticist if I call myself a geneticist, although I'm dealing with genes and gene expression in my work and my students' work and my collaborators' work. So in a broad sense, it's possible. It is correct, but I want to say that that there might be some people out there who would claim for themselves the title of a geneticist more justly than I can bestow on myself.
Got it. But coming from that place, could you please explain a non-expert like me and many like me, what is a gene? What is gene? I don't know. Yeah.
That is a tough question. And there are various ways how you can approach that. I think that there's no simple definition to it, because genes come in so many realizations. But fundamentally, that in the most common form, and not the only form, but the most common form of how information, and of course that skirts the problem, because then I would have to define what information is, but let's assume we both understand what information is for the time being. The most frequent form for organisms to transmit information from one generation to the next is by a highly structured molecule called DNA. And DNA has the property of being a large molecule that can exist in basically infinite variety of ways. So certain molecules can only exist simple molecules can only exist in one way. And let's say water is, an oxygen and two hydrogens, and they are combined in a certain angle with a certain strength, and that's the end of it, right? And then you can crystallize them when you have more molecule of the same chord, but the special property of DNA and other so-called nucleotides is that they are chains, and they are chains of different elements that are put together, 4 of them. And the special property is that any sequence of these sort of letters or building blocks, any arrangement is still a stable molecule, which means this molecule can exist in an infinite way of forms, while there are other molecules that are also chain molecules that can be very long, like starch, but it's always the same glucose in the same way, right? Or hyaluronic acid, and you have 2 of them always repeating in the same way.
Right.
and they can only exist in this highly stereotypical way. But DNA and other so-called polynucleotides have the ability to be chemically stable in a infinite variety of ways. So there's more than infinite many. That's mathematically doesn't make sense, but emotionally it conveys what we are talking about. There's an unlimited array of possible realizations of this molecule.
Right.
That's one chemical property. The other chemical property is that they can replicate. They can make copies of themselves because these building blocks, attract corresponding building blocks on the other side, and then they can make basically a copy of themselves, positive, negative, like in photography. Before we had electronic photography, you had a negative and a positive, and so. And in a similar way, the molecule can make a negative of itself, which then can make a positive of itself again. And so, in this way, the information can be passed on to copies of the same type of molecule.
Right.
So this is the chemical core of why life in a stable form is possible. There are other ways of how you can inherit stuff, but they are much less. They are much more vulnerable, like language, culture, and so on. They also have the property of inheritance, of information transfer to the next generation, but they are much more vulnerable to change and or for disintegration, let's say, right? But this molecule or this type of molecules are the most stable way of how we can transmit information from one generation to the next. Okay, so that's so genes are certain segments of such a molecule. And they have originally been discovered by the fact that the differences in parts of this molecule can lead to stable and predictable differences in the organisms that have them. Right, so they look like elements or pieces of information that you can recombine with others. That's how Mendel discovered genetics, or not genetics, but genes, and out of which then the science of genetics grew. So in a way, genes are the physical realization of pieces of information about an organism.
Right.
Right.
Right. So like I am just really, taking leaps of imagination, like trying to understand what you're saying and then saying where it is leading me. So when this transmission happens, as it replicates itself, is there a loss of some kind? And that's why the child of the parent does not look exactly like them, but it is something like them. But this loss is I don't know if, first of all, there is a loss in this replication process. But if there is a loss, is that the new thing that then is formed?
Right. I mean, there's a loss of information because there can be errors of copying.
Yeah.
Right. And this is understood to be the main source of novelty. But you refer to these transposable elements and these genomic parasites. Sometimes information can also come from the outside.
Right.
It's not that frequent, but it does happen, and it can have a fundamental consequences, or and so it's not just replication is an important form of novelty, but there are other forms of novelty as well, and that we have to realize. For instance, symbiosis, where organisms that lived organisms or species that lived their life happily beside each other, all of a sudden come together, and for whatever reasons that we can discuss and speculate about, get stuck together. And now they are actually forming a new unit, and there's a form of innovation that in itself is not just coming from copying errors in one particular lineage of descent, but it comes from an act of fusion, if you want. Wow. So, for instance, maybe the most famous case is so the forms of organisms that we belong to, humans and mammals and so on. The very broad realm of organisms that we belong to is called the so-called eukaryotes. This means that we are made of cells that have a cell nucleus, right? And almost all of these cells with a nucleus have another organelle in it, another structure in it, that's called the mitochondrium, which, from a functional point of view, can be characterized as the place where a lot of the biological energy is generated out of oxygen and so on. But it turns out that this mitochondrium used to be a bacterium that was just eaten by one of the pre-eukaryotic cells, but instead of being digested, it's got them into a marriage, and then they live together, and in a way they can't get separated anymore. I mean, there's few exceptions where, as everything in biology has exceptions, but it's very rare that you have a eukaryotic cell without a mitochondrium, and it is even the case that some of the genes of the DNA that was in the bacterium is then has been transferred over into the nucleus, and so the bacterium cannot get out anymore because it doesn't have the information to be a free living bacterium anymore. So we have now a new unit, a true innovation,
right,
that comes from symbiosis, from fusing together of different forms of life, which is a form of innovation that is not simply just copying errors in one line of descent. So and similar with these parasites, with these transposable elements that you mentioned before, there are sometimes viruses that infect our cells, and they, you can't get rid of them, and then you have them in there. They have their own internal life. They multiply inside your cells, but they can also become sources of innovation, because you can take some of these molecules and use them for something that's good for you, right? And there's a form of innovation that is also not simply only random copying errors, right? So it's more than that, and it is always very polymorphic, as we say, has many shapes and ways of being.
Infinite possibilities, yes. So the one thing I would like to understand from you is, so when these two things came together, the nucleus and the other bacteria, right? And they came together and they combined, and the bacteria couldn't get out of it, and the other was also ready to it had to undergo some changes because it's mixing up with something new. So this is the stuff of something that is alive, very, very alive. They're alive in themselves. They have a life of their own, very active life. So that now, even in that film, in that scene, the first cell, as she says, divides. Now, for something to produce something out of itself, what does it require? Does that mean that fundamentally each cell has life, but does each cell also has intelligence? Like, I don't know, is it a question I should ask a biologist, or I don't know, but is it even a valid question? Because something happened. Because
I think you have to re-articulate what the question is.
Oh, sure. So what I'm trying to say is that when the first cell divided, like that's what point is that? What made the cell divide? How did it come about? and was forces acting on it? Do we have any data on what made the first cell ever divide, or it's open to speculation right now? And does that mean that the cell had intelligence? It has life, but does it mean, what does it mean?
Well, I mean, it so in the forms of life that we are dealing with and of which we are part of, you already mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that each cell comes from another cell.
Yes.
But of course, that has to have an historical beginning, because the universe existed without cells before, and there are many places in the universe that doesn't have cells, and maybe others where they are, but they have their own cells and are independent of ours. It's probably cells because they need to be different from the environment chemically. So cells are fundamental because they are able to have a boundary around themselves. Anyway, how do we get to the first cell is still the fairly difficult and probably unanswered question. There might be a development over the last 10, 20 years that I'm not aware of, where now people think they do understand it, but I haven't heard anyone saying it in my presence. So with that caveat, I think I don't have an answer to that. There are many aspects that have been researched and relatively clear, but they are elements of an understanding of the question that you're asking, but they are not a complete story yet, as to the degree I understand it.
Sure. Thank you.
And there are various ways how we can sort of think of the transition from lifeless organic chemistry to biology, and there are many steps in between, and many problems that need to be solved, and to see how that can unfold in a stepwise fashion. Because one thing we probably can exclude is that it just emerged in one step, like a cloud can form, or a crystal of sugar can form as syrup, right? That's not how life works. So therefore, understanding its origin is particularly difficult, and is actually a large list of problems. It's not just one problem, right? First, we have to understand how the fundamental molecules of life, like amino acids and nucleotides, could have been produced without having an organism whose metabolism produces them. And then, the problem is which of the kind of molecules was able to replicate. It's probably but you not only need to replicate, you also have to control chemical reactions, which we call metabolism in extant organisms. So the answer to that question nowadays seems to be that it wasn't DNA. So what is our genome nowadays? It is a slightly different form of nucleotides, polynucleotide, namely RNAs, the ribonucleotides, and they are actually more able to catalyze chemical reactions and can replicate. So you have in one molecule what's now in DNA and proteins. RNA can actually do both, can control chemical reactions and replicate. So probably some very early form of life has to be based on RNA rather than DNA, and DNA came later. And proteins probably came later. And the role of proteins could temporarily be played by some minerals that have sort of catalytic properties, where sort of the RNA would lean against a mineral, and then the mineral would help catalyze some chemical reactions that the RNA can take advantage of. And then you have to package them into cells so that they don't diffuse, dilute into the ocean and stop existing. But even if you have them packaged, then you have to have a way of dividing them in a way. I don't know. We have a story for that. You can see it is a very long list of.
Yeah, it's quite a story. It's quite a story. Yes, yes, yes.
But it's not a story yet. That's my point.
Parts
I
of
mean,
the story.
there's sort of all of these little
Few chapters
elements
missing.
we understand that we need to understand. Some of them we understand better. Others we only know that's a problem. And whether there is intelligence at the very beginning, that's an even worse question, because the way we understand intelligence is tied to highly organized either electronic or biological processes. So, I mean, they are able to self-organize, creating, more complex structures out of simple structures. But that's also the case with snowflakes, right? So there is some element of ability to create complexity even in non-living. So this is probably what allowed this transition to happen, right? There's some physical tendencies under certain circumstances to self-organize, and then if the self-organization is then organized in a way that it is itself captures this capability, that's then probably life, which later can have intelligence, as we presume as we have this conversation. I'm not sure how far we can trace that back to this, dark early times.
Right. So, okay, great. So I'll shift gears a little bit here. I watched one of your lectures. It's slightly older, the one you gave at Yale. It's in 2009. It was titled Evolvability.
Okay.
I watched bits of it, and in the beginning you talked about, I don't know what your views are today, so I'll base it on what I heard. You said that the standard model of evolution, one of the problems is perhaps that it is not intuitive enough. Right? So now, I mean, there are so many questions we can get into. What is the standard model? What do you mean it lacks intuition? If it had intuition, what do you think it would look like? But that's not where I'm going. What I want to understand from you, from the perspective of an evolutionary biologist, what would you say is the selective or evolutionary advantage of intuition?
Of evolution.
Of intuition. The selective advantage of intuition.
You mean intuition?
Intuition, yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, intuition is, of course, a behavioral capability of humans, and I'm sure also of a lot of mammals, non-human mammals. Elephants are very intelligent, and of course birds, some birds, and probably also octopuses, cephalopods. And so intuition is a way of taking complex information and producing expectations about the world in a non-formal way, and in a way that is not bound to a language. When the main advantage of language and science, as it derives from language and lives on top of language, is that language can be looked at as a phenomenon itself, and we can reflect upon what we said. We can reflect on what the words mean, and we can sort of reconstruct how our understanding of one thing depends on the other, and how we can sort of make a stepwise reconstruction of what we believe is right or wrong, or and so on. Well, it seems like that intuition is living on a substrate that's not tied to language, and is therefore hard to access in a conscious and analytical way. So that you can take a part of what leads to what conclusion, right? I mean, that's the beauty of mathematics, that you can actually write it down and then be very explicit and be able to understand what follows from what, and in a very structured way. And that requires language or things that are derived from language, namely notation systems that mathematicians have developed, which are forms of are a form of language.
Yes.
I mean, when I studied mathematical logics in Vienna, we had one professor whose lecture notes didn't contain any German words. It was all formulas from the beginning to the end, maybe 90% of it, and maybe a few words in between. But the information was just notational in the form of what you call formulas. And so what is the advantage of intuition? Intuition can be very quick, while deduction and reasoning is slow. In order to think yourself through a problem, you need a lot of quiet and a lot of time, unless you have done it before, right? If it's a new thing you need to figure out, it takes a lot of time and energy, while intuition is quick and hard to access in the form of language. And since it is quick and can give reasonable results in a quick way, it also allows us to make decisions that need to be done quickly. Of course, if you need to survive, you have to assess complex situations, whether they are threatening or not.
Yeah.
Right? And that is best done intuitively, because if you start thinking, well, this color over there, that could be the color of a tiger, or it could be a particular fruit, or whatever, or this movement can be due to an animal or the wind, and then what is the probability of one or the other? You're eaten by a tiger, right? If you have a complex perception of a complex situation that is transformed into an action quickly and non-formally, then your chances of surviving is higher. So that's yeah. Probably what I would answer if you would ask me that question.
Yeah, and I understand it. It's very, very interesting. So one thing I also wanted to ask you is, you have a background in chemical engineering, you have a background in mathematical logic, and now you are a biologist. Would you say that your understanding, to whatever level, of these subjects have somehow influenced your approach to biology, contributed to it in some way?
I mean, we all are the products of our biography, and of course, I think the sort of typical way of how I approach biological problems is influenced by a polarity between being rooted in chemistry, sort of a rather rational and sort of hard-nosed area, as well as being trained quite extensively in philosophy on the other hand. So this tension between sort of philosophy and inorganic, so-called hard sciences is I find the best area, the tension field between the two, to be a biologist, because I think life is living in this tension of materiality and transcendence in a certain sense, in the historicity at the one hand, right? Transcendence is not historicity, and materiality are the two things that between which the life exists.
Very interesting, very interesting. And I think with that, those were all the questions I had for you, Professor
Those
Wagner.
were excellent questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Very wonderful conversation, and thank you for being able to have the conversation with you.
No, I'm so glad, and to have found these answers to the questions that I prepared, because questions in an inarticulated form, they were always with me. And I think they're with a lot of people. Okay, before we end, there is one question that I really want to ask you.
Okay.
Now, we've been talking about evolution. We've talked about so many things. I don't know. So I will not be able to put my finger to it, but I have somewhere heard here and there that the times that we are living in with internet, with high technology and high degrees and fast pace and everything, it's changing us fundamentally on a molecular level, on a biological level. Like these are some, let's say, from these popular media channels, through TV shows, through magazines, through write-ups. Something similar to this is an idea that I have heard. I don't know if anybody else has heard, or if it is so. But would you say that the times we live in is changing the process of evolution, maybe in terms of speed, that it has taken place so far?
With the development of culture, or with the origin of culture in human history, we always change the environment in which we exist and the environment in which we succeed or fail. Mm-hmm. And so this co-evolution between culture and our biology is something that was with us since the beginning of humans. Mm-hmm. Right, and sort of what you're talking about is just another iteration of that.
Right.
And in what way it plays out, I'm not in a position to say, because I even haven't thought about it to try to understand it. But it's, I mean, how it plays out and through what mechanisms that would lead to biological change, I think, is also an open question. Yeah. Well, because in the most hard-nosed Darwinian way, one would ask, in the new environment, who is the one who gets more babies? Mm-hmm. Right? Are there certain personality types or forms of intelligence that lead to higher reproduction of certain people versus others? And that would certainly change the biology of the human species. Whether there are other pathways through forms of stress and epigenetic changes is a possibility, but it's harder to map it, how that would play out. I mean, we know that environment can change the DNA in a way that is transgenerational, gets inherited. How much of that stays with the is a question. How predictable that is, how adaptive that is still open to debate. But there are other ways of how our environment and the way how we live affects our biology. But that's still fairly unsettled. I mean, there are no simple answers, and the only thing I can say, just don't trust anyone who pretends to have the answer.
They're trying to sell you something, as they say. Right. So with that, we can end this amazing, lovely conversation with you, Professor Wagner. I again want to thank you for your time and for all these lovely insights that you broke down for us, the non-experts, in the words that you did. Thank you.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
My conversation with Professor Wagner was thoroughly inspiring, to say the least. It helped me appreciate the infinite ways in which biological life has been and continues to be creative. How, from the simplest of realizations to the most complex forms, life always seems to find a way to not just exist, but persist and persevere and unfold itself in ever more unimaginable forms and ways. It's quite thrilling and humbling to be a result of this creative process, which allows us humans to participate in novelty creation as well. It will be wonderful to know your thoughts on the conversation, and if it inspired your worldview in any way. Thanks for being here. I will see you soon with another interesting mind, demystifying another interesting subject. Until then, take care.